Number 5. Hawker Siddeley Harrier. Developed during the 1960s for the British military, the Hawker Siddeley Harrier was the first of the Harrier jump jet series of attack aircraft. It was the first operational ground attack and reconnaissance jet with vertical short takeoff and landing capabilities. This made the Harrier especially useful for situations with limited ground space and short runways, giving it an advantage over most other aircraft at the time. The Harrier was first used by the British Royal Air Force RAF. Most of the planes were positioned in West Germany, where they stood ready to respond to a potential invasion by the Eastern Bloc. In the 1970s, the United States Marine Corps USMC obtained its own fleet of Harriers. They used the aircraft mainly for close air support and typically operated the planes from amphibious assault ships, which were prepared to respond to an enemy by air, land, and sea. During that same period, the Harrier's designers continued to develop, improve, and diversify its capabilities. They created the British Aerospace Sea Harrier jet fighter, which was capable of vertical takeoff and landing. It was used primarily by the British Navy starting in 1980. Both the Harrier and the Sea Harrier fought in the Falklands War between the UK and Argentina in 1982. The planes proved to be crucial to the British effort owing to their versatility. Several other variations of the Harrier were developed over the following years, but the earliest models are no longer in service. The last first-generation Harriers were retired in 2006 by the Thai military, and the Indian military withdrew the final Sea Harriers from service in 2016. While some of the planes ended up on display in museums, others have met less glamorous ends. The aircraft in this photo is a British Aerospace Harrier II. It's a second-generation model that was developed based on earlier Harriers and first entered service during the late 1980s. This particular plane somehow ended up in the River Ems in northern Germany in 1991. Very little information is available regarding the circumstances surrounding the photo other than the fact that it was taken in the West German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Based on when and where the image was taken, the Harrier was likely serving under a squadron of the Royal Air Force that was stationed in Germany. Much like the Harrier jets before it, the Harrier II was on standby to deter Soviet aggression. The aircraft was forced into early retirement in 2010 due to financial pressures on the British military. Number 4. The world's largest ship graveyard. Along Africa's western coast is a small peninsula called Ras Nouadhibou. It's shared between Mauritania and Western Sahara. The eastern side, occupied by Mauritania, is home to the city of Nouadhibou. With a population of around 100,000 residents, it's the country's second largest settlement. It's also Mauritania's financial capital. But Nouadhibou has some less brag-worthy accomplishments. It's where you'll find the world's largest ship graveyard, with roughly 300 dilapidated vessels crammed along a section of its coastline. The ship started amassing over a century ago, starting with a French Navy cruiser called the Chasseloup-Laubat. Built during the 1890s in response to the French military's growing fears about Italy and Germany's advancing fleets, the vessel was meant to bolster the country's cruiser force throughout its colonial territories. After World War I, the Chasseloup-Laubat was decommissioned and sold to a private fishery. It functioned as a water cistern and a floating warehouse before falling into disrepair and being deserted at Nouadhibou during the 1920s. At one point, it was converted into a floating theater, but it wasn't long before the ship went back to being little more than a pitiful hunk of rusting metal, much like all the other vessels that accumulated in the harbor over the following decades. When the Mauritanian government ran into money problems, authorities began accepting bribes from ship owners in exchange for allowing them to abandon their unwanted boats in the harbor. Unwanted boats also appeared for other reasons, including failed business ventures and owners who bought old vessels only to realize they were in way over their heads when it came to the amount of repairs and maintenance they needed. The problem increased dramatically throughout the 1980s. Corrupt officials were more willing than ever to overlook the environmental hazards associated with carelessly dumping a ship for the sake of financial gain, resulting in the fascinating but incredibly dangerous collection of derelict vessels that remain at the site today. Mauritania lacks the infrastructure to properly dispose of the boats in Nouadhibou harbor, and the ships were continuing to appear as recently as 2013. While the coastline is littered with old ships, some stand out among the others. One of the most famous wrecks at Nouadhibou Bay is the nearly 400-foot-long United Malika, a Moroccan reefer vessel that ran aground in 2003. Luckily, all 17 crew members survived and were rescued by the Mauritanian Navy. Numerous ideas for how to best help the country clean up the ship graveyard has been put forth over the years, but none of these proposals have come to fruition. And while an increasing number of activists are calling for the mess to be properly dealt with, the government has yet to take meaningful action. The ships have had some unintended positive effects. They function as artificial reefs and have helped to restore marine species that were previously decimated by overfishing. They're also home to birds, and some of the boats have even come to function as de facto ecosystems. But the hazards of the wrecks outweigh the benefits, and the ship graveyard continues to be a lucrative source of income. In addition to the lack of resources for disposing of the ships, the ability for locals to make money from the vessels discourages authorities from taking swift action to stem the pollution. The future of the site remains uncertain, as environmental activists and profit-driven minds remain entangled in a tug-of-war over what the appropriate next steps are. Number 3. Mallows Bay Ghost Fleet. Located on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, Mallows Bay is home to what many describe as the largest shipwreck fleet in the Western Hemisphere. The small bay's relatively shallow waters are littered with the decaying remnants of hundreds of old ships, including nearly 230 World War I-era United States Shipping Board Merchant Fleet Corporation vessels. At least 100 of the wrecks consist of the remains of wooden steamships that were built for crossing the Atlantic Ocean during the Great War. There was a steel shortage at the time, leaving shipbuilders with no choice other than to work with what was available to them, namely wood. But using outdated materials and building the vessels as quickly as possible proved to be problematic. By the time many of the wooden ships were completed, they were both obsolete and poorly built. Not a single one of the ships crossed the ocean by the time Germany surrendered and the war came to an end. At that point, there was no longer a steel shortage, rendering the vessels completely useless to the American military. In the war's immediate aftermath, the unwanted ships were stored in the James River at a cost of around $50,000 per month. The Navy had no use for them and didn't want them. It seemed like they had finally found a home when the Western Marine and Salvage Company bought them and towed them to Mallows Bay in 1925. But the business went bankrupt and the ships were burned and abandoned. During World War II, the Bethlehem Steel Company recovered any useful metal from the wrecks. Several dozen wrecks remain visible to this day. In the 1960s, activists raised environmental concerns over the possibility that hazardous materials from the ships were polluting the bay. A closer look revealed that the wildlife was actually benefiting from their presence and that many species had taken up residence among the wrecks. Today, the site continues to function as an artificial reef hosting an array of wildlife. It's a popular destination among canoers and kayakers and was declared a national marine sanctuary in 2019. Visitors are reminded to exercise utmost caution and respect among the wrecks and not to climb onto the ships or take anything, but to respectfully observe, take photos, and leave the site just as they found it. Number 2. World War II Aircraft Graveyard. Hundreds of World War II-era planes have come to rest at the bottom of the world's oceans. Some crashed and met tragic ends, while others were submerged on purpose to avoid having them fall into the wrong hands. And it's easy to forget how many of these historic aircraft are lurking out of our sight. After all, it's easy to forget about something that you have to actively look for to know it's even there. In recent years, a Coast Guard diver and underwater photographer from Wisconsin named Brandy Muller has helped to draw attention to some of these hidden planes. During her travels in the South Pacific, she visited an underwater graveyard of U.S. military aircraft that were deliberately dumped at the end of the war near the Marshall Islands. Muller was scuba diving several miles off the coast of the island of Roy Namur when she captured stunning images of the more than 150 planes that American forces discarded into the ocean in 1945. She encountered the sprawling site at a depth of roughly 130 feet, where they sit surrounded by coral, fish, and other sea life who have repurposed the vehicles as artificial reefs. Numerous iconic American planes can be found among the collection, including Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 4FU Corsair, and TBF-TBM Avengers. Muller told the Daily Mail that many of the aircraft are impressively intact for their age and for having sat in ocean water for upwards of 70 years. She described the experience as weird and strange, mainly because airplanes don't belong underwater. But once she got past the eeriness of exploring the out-of-place vehicles, she said that the opportunity to see them up close was both amazing and special. The young woman was particularly taken aback by the realization that the dozens of vehicles were in good working order when the military disposed of them. This much is clear even based on their current condition. Even though time has taken an obvious toll on the planes, they don't seem to bear any serious battle-related damage. Many, if not most of the planes likely arrived in the Marshall Islands in 1944 during the Battle of Kwajalein, which lasted for 4 days starting in late January of that year. The Japanese were outnumbered and ill-prepared, but nevertheless fought with fierce resistance, leaving just 51 survivors out of the 3,500 soldiers who participated in the battle. Over the following year, the two enemies grappled for control over the South Pacific, and the Allies eventually gained an upper hand. Even after losing their grip on the region, the Japanese continued to fight with everything they had until the country's official surrender following the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when all was said and done, the Americans no longer needed the planes they had brought with them, so they were sunken and soon forgot about. Number 1. $1 Million Point. Many of the U.S. military's attacks against the Japanese during World War II were launched from the island of Espiritu Santo, which is part of the Republic of Vanuatu in the South Pacific. When the war ended, American forces dumped literal tons of trash and dozens of vehicles in the waters off the island's coast. The discarded collection included bulldozers, tractors, forklifts, jeeps, trucks, and more. To many, it seemed wasteful to dispose of equipment that the local population could use and benefit from. But when the island's officials and the military failed to negotiate an agreement for the sale of the vehicles, materials, the nearby ocean became a junkyard for the machinery. U.S. officials determined that tossing the equipment like trash was more cost-effective than bringing it all back to America, and since they were unwilling to donate it, that's what happened. The Americans didn't necessarily have a direct grudge against the locals in Vanuatu, but at the time the archipelago was under British and French colonial control, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't leave either country's military with any free equipment or supplies. They offered the goods for sale at a low cost, but the British and French reportedly believed that if they turned down the offer, the U.S. would be left with no choice but to leave everything behind for free. So they got rid of every last possible item of value, including bottles of Coca-Cola, clothing, and everything else. They even drove their bulldozers into the water after using them to dispose of the rest of their inventory. In hindsight, some experts have speculated that the U.S. may have gotten rid of the vehicles because a massive influx of low-cost machines into the American market posed a potential threat to the national economy. But this realization doesn't make it any less shocking or disappointing to picture Navy Seabees driving the equipment off a purpose-built ramp and into the water as residents looked on. It's also been discovered that the official military records from the time fail to convey the magnitude of the dumping. Actually, if anything, they wildly downplay the amount of vehicles and other items that were tossed into the sea, claiming that just a modest amount of dumping took place. The blatant falsification of these records indicates that the American military was perhaps all too aware that their decision to ditch millions of dollars worth of machinery was controversial from both an environmental and an ethical standpoint. Once U.S. forces cleared out, locals salvaged what they could of the materials, but the vast majority of what was dumped remains at the site to this day. It's popular among divers, but for some, it's a reminder of a hugely wasteful decision to pollute the environment and extend little consideration for the best interests of the people living in the area. Thanks for watching. Have you ever seen a plane or a car or a ship at the bottom of a lake or some other body of water? Tell us about it in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.